All In Sports Network. We love sports.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Ben Peck here on the All In Aggies YouTube channel, part of the All In Sports Network, Rogue Sports Media Network. And today we have a very special edition of All In Aggies with the good folks, Tanner and Jake from All In Horns. By the way, if you do have some Texas, like maybe family or friends who are interested in all that, be sure to check them out. Or, you could always check them out for a perspective on the Austin side of things. I hopped on there a little bit earlier, so we had a great discussion on that. If you want to see that, again, go over and check out All In Horns. But we'll get to it now on the All In Aggies platform here and just kind of get y'all's perspective on some things relating to this game, the rivalry, and everything else. I guess my first question for you guys, and y'all can take this however you want. I'm curious how Texas fans feel about the rivalry now in this new league compared to where it was in the Big 12. And I'll kind of give my diatribe and see what y'all think about this. And just a disclosure for those who don't know, I've talked about this. I went to high school out here. I got here 2005. So my first year out here, y'all were winning national championships. But I kind of viewed it from afar and, Big 12, Texas A&M. I felt like at that time, it probably was accurate to say A&M just in terms of a financial playing field and everything else was maybe more in line with like a Texas Tech or where like A&M or Baylor and TCU got when they started getting good in the Big 12. But after the SEC, after Johnny Manziel, and I know this is the evergreen debate, I feel like this is a new A&M program, a new A&M athletic department. Hasn't necessarily gotten it to its potential in football, but we've seen it with other sports. So I always use, different analogies like, I say I'm a Cubs fan too. So I think that's part of why I've identified with the Aggies struggle for so long. I feel like the Aggies kind of transitioned from being the Cubs to being the Red Sox, where they're more or less in it every year or should be in it. It's just they haven't quite gotten over the top just yet. And I guess the big thing I'm curious for you guys, I know there's all this discussion about Texas and Oklahoma for Texas fans. That's the matchup. And that's the one that everyone focuses on. To me, it's always felt like that was the case because in the Big 12, that was the power struggle. And it was between those two in terms of who's going to be in the throne, in the driver's seat to where, whoever's on top, if they just handle their business, you got to knock them off first before you can worry about anything else. I wonder in this new SEC, not only where A&M is at, but if Oklahoma, schools like that are sort of just as much in your way as, a whole handful of teams, whether it be LSU, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, if Florida ever gets its act together. And if A&M is in that mix as well. So does it feel to y'all like not to be a shill for the SEC, but like it just means more these days because everyone's sort of on more equal playing field?
Jake, you want to go ahead and take it first, and then I'll jump in later.
So I think Tanner would agree with me on the first sentiment I'm going to say as far as the SEC view goes. I think a lot of Texas fans, quite frankly, are just they don't care about the conference perspective of we want the conference to do well. Right. It's about Texas doing well, and part of that, and it is an arrogance because Texas is obviously coming out of their worst decade in the history of the program. And it was terrible. I lived through it. But a lot of us did see a national championship, a ton of 10-win seasons in a row. So it's always been around Texas getting to the mountaintop, not more so looking at the other teams. But I will say from a game-to-game perspective, it is a different outlook in the SEC. It's just as far as playing in Iowa State compared to playing a Florida. It is a different feeling going into the game. Even though I knew Texas is probably going to handle Florida this year, you still know if you just look at a blue chip ratio percentage on the team, Florida is going to have significantly more than an Iowa State. I went to the Arkansas game in Fayetteville, and you look at pregame warmups, and I look at Arkansas, and I went to the K-State game a couple of years ago, and I'm like, this is a different size and speed of football team compared to what I saw with K-State, who was competing for the Big 12 title in that year, 2 years ago. just a different level of athletes that are on the field. So there is something to that. I mean, the SEC undoubtedly has better talent from top to bottom on every single team. And then it just comes to how those programs kind of harness that talent. From the Texas and Texas A&M perspective, and Tanner and I covered this week, is in the past, when this rivalry is going on, we looked at 2000 and on, not because we were trying to cherry pick anything, but because we were born in the early 90s.
Right.
That's about the time where you start remembering. And it was lopsided, right? And the games were lopsided. And so the rivalry was never the same as the OU rivalry. But to your point, if every year the Texas-Texas A&M game in this new SEC is going to have the stakes that this year's game does, it could surpass OU from a rivalry standpoint, because there is no doubt the hatred between Texas and Texas A&M. But I do also think A&M in history leading up to this has always been viewed as a secondary rival in maybe 90% of Texas fans' heads. But that could change with this new look.
And I think I think that has a lot to do with, because the game at the end of the season in the Big 12 never really amounted to make or break seasons for really either team. And I think a lot of times Texas was head and shoulders a better team, and all they had to do was go out and perform as such and move on to, say, the Big 12 championship game or whatever it was. It wasn't the winner of this game goes to the Big 12 championship, and this is a big monumental moment in the season, a tide-changing type of game, and we just never really got that, at least within our lifetime. I'm not saying it didn't happen in the 80s. I'm not saying it didn't happen, really throughout the 90s. It's just really since that time frame of our age group growing up with this rivalry, it was the only team that can really stand in our way of getting to a national championship is Oklahoma, and so that was, or maybe a good Texas Tech year. And sometimes A&M is good. You had some good teams with Stephen McGee and Ryan Tannehill, and there were some good teams that could challenge Texas in some of those years, but it never felt as though like Texas has to beat Texas A&M to get to a national championship. And I think that's kind of where it came from. This year, like you guys have said, much different in that aspect. And so it does seem like there's way more at stake in this game this year in the SEC. And I think that goes and shows the growth of Texas A&M as a football program as a whole.
So kind of going off of that, I'll set it up from the A&M perspective for a little bit. I said one of the things that was interesting coming into this year, new SEC, first-year head coach Mike Elko. I thought of this the other week of like how to put it into words. Sort of like there's the pecking order within the SEC, and if everyone at A&M's level coming into the year or above just holds serve and wins the games they're supposed to, and even if A&M wins the games they're supposed to, but they lose to the teams they're behind at the moment, whether that be, again, coming into the year, whether that be a Mizzou, LSU, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, it just felt Texas and maybe even Oklahoma. It felt like even if A&M or anybody was doing as well as they could within their realm, you do that for a couple of years, it starts to get stale, and it's maybe harder for, like, for example, when Texas was 5-7 in year one under Sark, but they're in the Big 12. Like, you'd think eventually they can scale that. So I wonder, with the type of season A&M has had, and maybe it hinges on this game, does it feel like within the Longhorn fan base that A&M might have some real staying power moving forward, given sort of the somewhat of a splash they've been able to make to this point?
Can I say this just real quick? At the end of the day, if Texas wins this game, A&M finishes 8-4, and how many 8-4 seasons have we seen from A&M? Like, it's a continual thing. Like, it seems as though there's been a lot of years where Texas A&M will win 5 straight, and it's like, hey, they're making a little bit of a run, and then you fall to an Auburn. You trip over yourself against South Carolina or something along those lines. And so I think, at least from a Texas perspective, if A&M comes out and wins this game, they get to an SEC championship, and they can say, hey, because I think the last thing A&M fans really want to hear is Texas made an SEC championship before Texas A&M did, especially by beating A&M to get there. I think that's the last thing Aggie fans want to hear, and that's what they will hear if Texas wins. And so I think that will be a big deciding factor in terms of the outlook on this game. If A&M wins this game, goes on to an SEC championship, I think you'll get to that next notch of we respect you on a different level this now than we did previously. But if it ends up in a loss and you're playing in the Tax Slayer Bowl against Duke or whoever, I think it will kind of look like, yeah, well, same old Aggies, and that's at least from my perspective, Jake.
Right.
I'll kind of add on to that, and I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate because we talked about this on our podcast, but I actually respect Mike Elko, and I think he's probably the best hire A&M has made in any of our lifetimes as a football head coach. Now, will I be clowning A&M if Texas wins and they end 8-4? Of course, that's the job as the rival team.
Right.
But I will say I do think the direction they're moving in, I'm aware that A&M could have actual staying power and being able to grow under Elko as the head coach for that program. I do think they can grow into being what A&M should be. If you look at it from a financial perspective, if you look at it from a brand perspective, A&M should be at that top echelon of the SEC competing for a title every year. It's just never been the case. And obviously if they lose this game, I just think it looks so drastically from an outside of College Station perspective. If they lose this game, because it's the difference between, an 8-4 season or a trip to an SEC title game. But from my perspective, trying to look at it without my Longhorn glasses on, I do think it's different than other 8-4 seasons from A&M. Being under year one of a head coach who's quite frankly not a clown show like a Sumlin was, especially like a Jimbo Fisher was, someone who's more focused on the football than all the antics that go on in College Station.
And here's kind of how I've always kind of wanted to view the Texas A&M dynamic in terms of who is the power in the state of Texas, who owns control in the state of Texas. Is it would be great, honestly, for the game of football and for the state and for this rivalry, if you could have a random Florida State year where you're undefeated and 1 year it's Miami, 1 year it's Florida State, 1 year it's the Florida Gators, and you kind of just have this rotation, this cycle of who is the dominant team. Maybe it's for a 2-3 year stretch. Maybe you get a really good recruiting class and then A&M takes over a Texas program. Now that we're back in that SEC or back in the same conference in the SEC, I think it would only emphasize and make this rivalry greater and make this game even larger than it already is. If you get an A&M that is starting to put up a 10-win season and competing for SEC championships on a regular basis, kind of like we see in the state of Florida, where it seems like it's a rotating door of which one of those Florida teams is going to be the powerhouse of the state.
It's funny you say that because that's actually the example I go to all the time. I said this rivalry used to feel in my mind more like Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, or to where any given year Oklahoma State could be good, but I don't think Oklahoma ever felt threatened by them long term, to feeling like a Florida State where who is the program? You're like, I don't know, it kind of depends on how things are going. And what you were saying, Jake, about the 8-4, I think it is. I think that is why, and you touched on this, Tanner, about how big of a swing of perception we're going to have depending on who wins this game for A&M.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, I know, Aggie fans don't need to be reminded, 8-4 is the mean that they cannot stand. But I do actually genuinely feel like 8-4 under these set of circumstances, under a season like this, that we've seen across the country, is actually genuinely is objectively a lot more impressive of an 8-4 that it used to be even in the SEC, but without Texas and Oklahoma. But yeah, now it's I feel like 9-3 is sort of that needle mover of a record mark to where you go from saying they had some moments to where you start to say, okay, almost like Tennessee 2 years ago when they beat Alabama, or the year Mizzou had last year where they haven't quite arrived, but people start to take notice okay, they're cooking something over there, especially with
Can I talk about the perception of this game if Texas loses this game too?
Totally.
You're talking your two best games on your regular season. On the flip side of it, You've lost to Georgia, and now you're going to turn around and lose to the other team. I think Texas doesn't need this game in terms of their playoff hopes. I think they still get in, probably regardless. I mean, it would take a lot of other outside factors for Texas to drop completely out of the playoffs. So I think their postseason lives are still alive. However, how seriously they're taken and the legitimacy of how good this season really was. If you turn around and you got your two biggest losses in terms of the talent that you're faced against, Georgia and A&M, and you lost both of those games in terms of primetime games, college game day games, all eyes on you, and you fall flat both times, you're going to get that label of fraudulent. And so I think it's big for Texas in terms of their outlook, in terms of where they're moving forward. Now, yes, they've got a 10-win season and it looks great on the outside, but I think that perception, there's always going to be a little bit of the shadow of a doubt there in the back of their minds as well.
Right. It's funny you mentioned that, because when I was talking about the playoff breakdown, the past few weeks, I was looking ahead to this Texas game and saying, I think Texas A&M's kind of in a bad situation to where if they lose, it'll be like, obviously they're probably out of it, and then Texas, is for real, and that's going to hurt for its own reasons. But if A&M were to win, assume they would have been 10-2 with the win, I think people would have said, oh, well, actually, that has less to do with A&M actually being really good, especially now after losing to Auburn, because they took down mighty Texas. I think people would more so say, oh, I guess Texas probably actually wasn't that good, rather than like reflecting on how good A&M is. So to your point about the criticalness of this game for Texas, wanted to ask you, and Jake,
I can see Jake's face. Jake has something on his mind.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
he's going to explode here in a little bit.
That has been such a frustrating point for me, and for I think a lot of Texas fans, is all we've heard for years going into the SEC is what a gauntlet it is from not only top but to bottom.
Right.
And then Texas gets in, and all we hear about is a fraudulent schedule in which Texas scheduled Michigan. It's not their fault Michigan decided not to be as good as everyone thought they were going to be.
Absolutely.
And then also, if you look at Texas's schedule, all these teams complaining about Texas's schedule are losing to teams on Texas's schedule. And it just from a coming from the Big 12 to the SEC, it has been frustrating as hell to all of a sudden hear, well, you have such an easy schedule. And it's like, well, I thought it was a gauntlet. Is it a gauntlet or is it not?
You're right. Well, and we talked about it, on our show is who did Tennessee lose to? They lost to Arkansas. And who did Texas beat? Arkansas or Alabama. Who did they lose to? Vandy and Oklahoma. Who did Texas beat? Oh, Vandy and Oklahoma. Who did Ole Miss lose to? Florida and Kentucky. Oh yeah, Texas. If only other SEC teams had an opportunity like Texas to beat those types of programs to be in the college football playoffs. Oh wait, they all had a chance to beat those teams. And so I think that's where the frustration gets a little bit, because it's like you can only the teams who aren't living up to their expectations, like in Oklahoma, who is dog trash garbage this year, and like a Michigan who fell woefully short of their expectations. Like, that's not necessarily Texas's fault on the grand scheme of things. You got to go in and you schedule those games, and you hope they're marquee games. They end up not really being marquee games, but you did win those games, and then they kind of turn around and they win big games over an Alabama who's complaining about Texas's schedule. I'm like, well, you played them too, and you ended up losing to them. So so I think that's kind of where some frustration has been built in terms of the whole fraudulent phrase. But I do think that this is a big marquee, like big time, prime time moment where Texas needs to show up and play really good football. And if they don't and they fall short, it will also kind of, at least in the back of their minds, be like, man, how legit is this team going to be come playoff time and run through the playoff system?
Going off that, I wanted to gauge y'all's upset alert meter, let's say, in terms of how this team has been performing heading into this game, because it kind of a weird set of circumstances where you beat Florida and no one really gives them a lot of credit for that because of the quarterback situation. Again, one of those where it's not Texas' fault, just kind of happens to shake out that way. Unarguably, like their best performance within their last 3 SEC games. And then the Arkansas game, Jake, I guess you were there, like, got a little frisky for a little bit. Kentucky, I think to a lesser degree, but was not overly dominating, I would say. Like, I saw someone say they played fine. Like, they didn't play amazing, but they played fine, and it wasn't bad, but it wasn't like the whooping that you maybe could have seen. So I know there's this kind of sense that like almost like March Madness, like you always expect in these biggest games, teams just somehow, some way to figure it out and put their best foot forward in these biggest moments. I guess the worry for me, if I was a Texas fan, would be if there's been one game where we have seen Texas in that setting, it was Georgia. Now, Georgia is like a championship caliber. Maybe it's just Georgia's championship caliber program pedigree to where they're a unique exception to it. But we did not see Texas's best game going into that one. I guess in terms of the upset alert idea, how do we feel about Texas, how they're trending heading into this game, given some of these recent performances and knowing, if you go into a close game in the fourth quarter, like enter at your own risk, that might be a little more daunting than like closing out a Vanderbilt on the road or even Arkansas.
Yeah. I mean, so here's the thing is when you talk about Texas playing good or bad, I think it gets too looped into talking about the offensive side of the ball. Mm-hmm. Whereas the defense has been dominant in every single game this season. Their worst game as a defense, as far as yardage given up, is Florida. And all that was in the second half. They've given up over 300 yards one time this season. And that was to Florida. Georgia didn't do it. Arkansas didn't do it. And Arkansas is a good offense. And so, I look at it from the identity of Texas this year is just different than previous teams. They are not an offensive first team. They just
that we talked about that as an expectation, whether that be national media, the outside looking in, even as the own fan base of this is a Sarkisian ran offense with Quinn Ewers, who is a Heisman caliber quarterback, and all these weapons on the outside. Like, why are they not averaging 40 points per game? Well, the defense is holding teams to about 10, 12 points per game, so you don't need to score 30. But to your point.
Yeah,
Jake.
But Quinn has been inconsistent this year. That's undeniable. The offensive line has been pretty good to great for every game this year other than Georgia. And they have played good defensive fronts. OU has a very good defensive front. Michigan, even though they're a flawed team, their defensive front is one of the best in football. The Georgia game, they fell flat as an offensive line. But as far as from an upset meter perspective, I'm not just fully confident Texas is going to go into College Station and win this game. A&M's a good football team. They have a good head coach, not something I've ever said before. And they have a lot of talent across the board. And that defensive front, Texas is going to have to play like they did against Michigan or against Oklahoma on the offensive line for them to win this game. Because if they have a Georgia game and Quinn, he's not super mobile to begin with, but might be even more limited depending on how his ankle is doing. There is a clear path to victory for A&M in this game. So, my confidence percentage of a Texas win is not that much above 50%. I mean, I give a lot of respect to this Aggie football team.
I'll let you weigh in here.
Go ahead.
I want to see too, though, in terms of for you, like not just in terms of like the risk of a loss, but like how confident are you that like Texas, in terms of Texas putting its best performance forward, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I think the defense is going to show up. They've given me no sign. They've given me nothing all season long aside from stepping up and going above and beyond expectations set either at the beginning of the season or on a week-to-week basis. Every time we're like, well, if Arkansas is good at the big play and, that Taylon Green can really make plays with his legs, extend the pocket, and he's got a good arm, and then the defense shuts him down. And anytime we've ever had like, well, there might be a question, what about Carson Beck coming in? He's going to be the best passer that Texas has seen all season. They end up getting 3 interceptions from the guy, and they shut down the Georgia offense for they had one drive in that entire game that was over 36 yards that ended in points. And so, that is something for me where I know for a fact, I am confident 10 out of 10 that the Texas defense will show up and play and give the Aggie offense as much trouble, especially kind of knowing the identity of A&M's offense. It's run the ball. It's get Marcel Reed out in space. It's using those running backs, whether that be inside running, outside running, power run game, and sticking with that and trying to use the time of possession to their advantage. getting in, favorable first down, second, third down, situations for the offense. And so kind of knowing that's the identity of A&M, I don't think Texas is going to go into that game surprised by anything that they see that A&M's offense gives them defensively. Now, on the other side, I said this in our podcast, in our prediction episode, I think it's very likely that this game going into halftime could be 10-7, one team over the other. I think it could be a very slow start to the game. I think both offenses could find a little bit of a struggle early on. We might not see this thing broke out until in the second half, later in the second half. These two teams might be playing a little bit of a chess match on the defensive side of the ball. I would not be surprised in terms of seeing the Texas offense or the A&M offense struggling to get a lot of points in the first half or early on in this game. I expect this game to be pretty close, really throughout. I don't think I think A&M is going to cover the 5.5 point spread, and so that really gives A&M a good chance to win one way or the other.
I'll get y'all out on this, and you could throw a prediction out there if you want. I know you guys did a whole episode on it, but what's one thing, if you could find out one thing about this game, like you could go into the future and learn one element of it to get a sense of how this game's going to play out, what would the thing be that you'd want to know, just in terms of getting an indication of how this is going to play out?
For me, be one of two things. It'd either be the sack output for each team, or it would be the average second down and distance for each team. And I think that would give me a pretty good idea of what this game is going to look like for both offenses. Because I think pressure and obviously containing for there's other things for Texas with dealing with a running quarterback, but I think pressures is going to be key for both teams, especially A&M. And then I think second down and manageable, probably more so on the A&M side that looks to run the ball a little bit more, and just generating explosive plays against this Texas defense has been tough, no matter who the offense has been, is going to be very important in this game.
I'll be honest with you, just so I don't copycat what Jake said, because what he said is very true, and I don't want to be repetitive. But turnovers and penalties, I'll be completely honest with you. I think you're going to get a very good indication if Texas or A&M loses their composure in what is going to be a very emotionally charged game and gets a couple of late hits or unsportsmanlike conduct penalties or whatever it is on a money down on a midway through the field to put a team in field goal range or something along those lines. That's going to have a huge impact on the game. And I think turnovers, the only time we've seen Texas really struggle or have hurt them, it's when they hurt themselves. Whether that would be, versus a Vanderbilt, where I think Jake and I did the math, and Texas allowed, based just on penalties and turnovers, took 14 points off the board for Texas and gave Vanderbilt like 17 points. There was almost like a 30-point turnaround in terms of, shooting yourself in the foot with penalties and turnovers. And so if I had to get a perspective on the game before the game started, and you said that A&M had 3 turnovers, Texas had 0, and the penalty marker was about even at say six penalties per team, 50 yards given up, whatever that looks like. I would say Texas probably has a very good chance of winning. Same thing, vice versa. If Texas ends up turning over the ball and A&M protects it, I think A&M is going to have a very good chance of winning this game.
We shall see. It is going to be a hot ticket in town. By the way, what would be like your upper limit for like game at DKR? And I'd be willing to fork over. I mean, some of these tickets are ridiculous.
It's insane.
I believe it's the most expensive game in the history of the regular season for college or NFL.
Yeah, average ticket price.
I would say the most I'd be willing to fork over for this game, regular season, SEC championship game on the line, first time in 13 years. For nosebleeds in terms of cheapest ticket available.
Don't even factor, we'll teleport you. Don't even worry about the parking or how you
$350 to $400, I guess. I don't know. There is a limit. There is a limit.
Nosebleeds. For me, if it's going to be me sitting at the top of either one of these stadiums, which you're going to be looking down at little tiny dots running on the field, it's going to be around what Tanner said. But for sitting lower bowl, Yeah, I could probably double that. The problem is $750 a ticket gets you in the nosebleeds of this game.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I just could not fork that over to sit that high up.
Like friends and family, if you're wondering where like all your Christmas gifts went, I had to go to Kyle Field. So
Yeah.
that's what happened to that.
And
All
then the
right,
charge for
Tanner.
a charge for a couple beers along the way too, you know. Yeah. Yeah.
Then you do have to actually worry about the parking. I actually
Yeah.
think at that point you might be better off, like, instead of doing the tiny little dots, just like go to the game, be in the city, and just do the thing where you like tailgate and you watch it out there. So you're like
Yep.
in the atmosphere, but not like that atmosphere.
Yeah, right. 100%. It's right outside the stadium. So
Exactly. And you get to do all the post-game celebrations, festivities. Awesome. Well, Tanner and Jake from All In Horns, be sure to check out their podcast and especially our crossover episode over on their platform. Appreciate them taking some time just before Thanksgiving here as we get ready for golly, one of the most anticipated games I can remember in the state in a long time. Fellas, really appreciate it. And thanks for coming on.
hey, thanks for having us.
Awesome. We'll see y'all later.
All in Sports Network. We love sports.